The United States' new national security strategy makes it clear that despite the events in Ukraine, America still regards China as its main immediate and ongoing threat. Part of Washington's plan is to persuade European allies to adopt the same hard line against Beijing. However, not all members of NATO and the EU are quite as ready to put themselves in opposition to China, partly, of course, because it would cost them some serious money. Hello, I'm Philip Hampshire, and you're watching Roundtable. America wants to stop China's domination of the Indo-Pacific, and it wants the help of its NATO allies to do it. But the view from Europe is far more complex. While the US may be the guarantor of Europe's security, China is the EU's main trading partner. It's the definition of being between a geopolitical rock and a hard place. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak seems to be on board when it comes to hardening the rhetoric, recently declaring the golden era of relations with China to be over. But Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz recently returned from a trip to Beijing, and he says that the West should not be moving away from China. So, can America use its leverage with Europe gained in Ukraine to pressure its partners into getting tough on Beijing? Joining us to discuss this further, we have in Gallen in Switzerland, Professor Guido Cozzi, who is Professor of Macroeconomics at the university there. Meanwhile, in Guildford, we have Professor Amelia Hadfield, who's head of the Department of Politics at the University of Surrey. And in Brussels, we have Shea, who's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining me. I'm going to start off today with a graphic, just so that the viewers are aware of the size and scope of the issues here. In the year 2020, China was the main trading partner for the European Union. The result was partly due to an absolute massive increase in imports of around 5.6% by the EU from China, but China also bought around about 2.5% more stuff from the EU. At the same time, the US as a proportion of the EU's trade went down. The United States recorded a drop of imports from the EU of 13.2% and exports of 8.2%. So Guido, first question to you, if I may. Can Europe move away from China? That has to be the underlying question here at the start.
Well, Europe cannot move away from China all of a sudden, but certainly can diversify. By diversifying, I mean starting to consider also other markets. For example, India is a great market and it has great potential and great growth rates too. Plus, it has a younger workforce. The median age in China is comparable to that of the United States, is about 38 and a half years. In India, it is below the age, so 50% of the population will be below the age of 29, which means it has more prospects. So, considering the short-term COVID policy issues and the longer-term geopolitical and demographic issues, we can say that Europe could gradually move away from too much dependence on China, a country with some different institutions and cultures, and maybe start diversifying like it should in India and perhaps also in Africa.
Amelia, I saw you nodding there, so I think you believe that Europe could move away from China. Can it and should it, which is another separate question altogether?
I think that is exactly the question. It's the typical academic reaction of yes, well, then also no. At this point, we are finding ourselves, in a very difficult situation where there's tremendous pressure, I think, on the European Union to think, as Guido says, in terms of either decoupling, moving away, winding down, if you like. But it's incredibly difficult to do that quickly. There are limited areas in which to do this. I grant that India is an option, of course, and you have to look at markets and trade and inward investment, et cetera, and labor force. But the idea of decoupling quickly is a very tough one to get your head around. And also, I think it's difficult to talk about Europe in a very homogenous sense. We have very distinct attitudes towards China across Europe, whether we're talking about the European Union institutions or whether we're talking about particular member states. And I think what I would draw your attention to perhaps is the German perspective. So Olaf Scholz, German Chancellor, saying very, very recently, written and in public as well, that in fact the European Union should think twice about this. It should avoid the temptation necessarily to think in terms of dividing the world into blocks and instantly decoupling. So there is a larger philosophical issue, I think, at work here in terms of being able to sort of zip up one partner and just move over to another. It's not that easy.
Well, I'm going to take both of you to task in a few minutes for bringing up India. But first of all, let me bring in Jamie. Jamie, can Europe move away from China? Should Europe move away from China? I suppose the final third part is, will Europe move away from China? What's your take on all of this?
Well, my sense is that what it's all about is looking at certain key areas where dependency could produce vulnerability, and those vulnerabilities could give way to political blackmail or political pressure. The European Union has seen vis-a-vis Russia in the Ukraine conflict the consequence of being so dependent upon Russian gas and oil. And as you know, there's been this painful process in the EU of weaning itself off Russian gas and oil by that type of diversification, which other speakers have referred to. And I think now the EU wants to take the same approach towards China. So it's not a question of decoupling, but it's a question of looking at, is there too much direct foreign investment of China in European ports? Should we allow China, for example, to take over the third terminal of the port of Hamburg, a debate that the Germans have been having recently? What about the fact that Europe gets 90% of its rare earths, vital for electronics, from China? Is that a comfortable situation to be in? The COVID pandemic showed again the high degree of dependency on China for protective equipment, for all kinds of medicines, for medical precursors and the rest. So I think it's not a question of across-the-board decoupling, but looking at certain sort of critical sectors which are as geostrategic as they are economic, and make sure that Europe doesn't allow its margin of dependence to become too high and has alternative suppliers so that it can't be subject to blackmail or political pressure if, for example, there is some kind of big foreign policy dispute between China and the EU, as there has been recently, for example, over sanctions on China for its mistreatment of the Uyghurs, or the fact that the EU has stood up for little Lithuania when it was bullied by China after opening a Taiwan representation office in Vilnius.
Okay, Guido, let me bring you back in here. And earlier on, you mentioned that the European Union does have alternatives to China. It can move some of its manufacturing, for instance, across to India. Now, that's certainly been a message that's played out across the various different newspapers of the European Union. However, India and China have taken different paths to modernity. China's industrialization has been a secondary industry industrialization, building stuff, manufacturing stuff. India jumped straight over that step. They said, no, we're going for tertiary industries. We're going to have a service-based economy. We're going to focus on computers. We're going to focus on software. Does India have a manufacturing base Europe can substitute in for China, even in the longer term?
Well, clearly, China still has an advantage, but India has more growth prospects because its GDP per capita is much lower and its population is younger. And of course, it may take years, but in the longer run, for example, if one takes the OECD forecast in the long run in 25 years, by 2047, India's GDP will reach the GDP of the United States. So, forwarding the current situation, it would be like the situation nowadays with China and the United States. China's GDP at the moment is comparable in real terms to that of the United States. So in a quarter century, India will be in that position. Also, it's not just Europe. If you consider top firms in the United States, like Apple's, for example, they are moving the production of their new iPhone 14 to India, to Tamil Nadu's capital. So, and of course, after the Foxconn, turmoil and problems, we can easily understand why top firms worldwide are moving. And when top firms worldwide move to a subcontinent, I would say, they will develop the industrial base needed.
Amelia, can India substitute in for China?
Yes, I think it can. I'd agree with Guido. I know, as you pointed out, that you've had a sort of structural differentiation, if you like, in terms of how those markets have built up. And that has important implications for trade and inward investment and for labor, and even for speed in terms of how supply chains are constructed and then rendered effective. But I think India has actually proven itself, I think, across sectors. And I think its post-COVID bounce back, if I can call that, has demonstrated that it's a really up and coming market. I think it's also put some very aggressive policies on the table. It's been quite astute in terms of how it has managed those policies bilaterally. I think both with Europe and also with the United Kingdom, for example. So I think it looks possibly from the outside like a ready substitute. But as I've mentioned before, and Jamie's put his finger on that, it is a combination of high quality and sensitive areas, sensitive markets on the one side. And I think the larger goal of, what would decoupling do in terms of sending a political message? And what are the implications for that 5, 10, 20 years down the road financially in terms of, dividing up areas into regional trade blocs?
Well, Jens Stoltenberg, who is the current NATO Secretary General, has made some comments on this front. If we just play out a clip from him, you'll be able to hear them.
The war in Ukraine has demonstrated our dangerous dependency on Russian gas. This should also lead us to assess our dependencies on other authoritarian regimes, not least China, for our supply chains, technology, or infrastructure.
Now, what you were hearing in that clip obviously touches on exactly what Jamie was saying a few moments ago about the corresponding sticky predicament Europe found itself in with Russia, where it was relying on Russia for gas. Amelia, you're also a little bit nervous about this. But at the end of the day, Europe looked at the situation with Russia and said, trade partners, generally speaking, on average, go to war with one another less than people who are having trade wars with one another. We'll buy our gas from Russia, it'll tie them into the international system. Is that not the argument that's been put in place for China over the last 30 years?
It is, I think, in many ways, and it hasn't worked. And I think you can point to a whole host of ways in which this hasn't worked. And I think the global euphoria and expectation levied upon China when it first joined the WTO, World Trade Organization, might be an example. The idea that the sort of inward pull, the centrifugal pull, if you like, of the WTO would render China not just more acquiescent in terms of the rules and regs of trade, but somehow this would have a spillover effect in terms of allowing it to work its way within the rule of law, if you like, global governance, democracy even. And perhaps we even saw this with the Beijing Olympics back in 2008. So there are these high expectations that you play by our rule books, and you'll be normed by them to some extent. And while this, I think, in terms of European enlargement, worked nicely with Eastern Europe, and to some degree, there was a sort of symmetrical expectations in terms of energy security with Russia. That's just collapsed completely now. And, Russia has, gone quite literally beyond the pale in every sense by invading Ukraine. And the European Union is not prepared to put up with this in terms of security, diplomacy, policy, and energy. It's added energy and it's become an energy war.
Well, let me bring in Jamie there. Jamie, you're formerly of NATO. So I'm assuming you agree with the comments from Jens Stoltenberg.
Well, he was my former boss, so of course I have to agree with him. Yes, no, indeed. Nobody wants to break commerce with China. It's very important for Europe to recover from COVID and, of course, also from the current economic problems in the wake of the war in Ukraine. Mercedes, for example, sells nearly 900,000 cars to China every year, so this is vital for the economy. And I agree with what's been said, that any diversification strategy can't happen overnight. But I think in Brussels, where I am, the buzzword is we mustn't be naive about this. We've got to sort of basically not allow things to happen automatically, but have some greater control. For example, on direct foreign investment, should we allow China to have 10% of a port or 20%? Where do we draw the line between a legitimate economic investment and the possibility of gaining leverage? So there's a greater desire to screen. There's a greater desire, and Amelia referred to this, to have reciprocity reciprocity, that China joined the WTO and promised, of course, therefore, to respect intellectual property of the European companies investing in China. This hasn't happened. So there's a greater sense of, to try to make China play by the rules, and as has happened in the case of Lithuania, to take China to the panels of the WTO to try to get some kind of an enforcement regulation on this as well. And then, of course, to look at the type of areas where Europe traditionally has been very dependent, for example, on chips, and then think, well, even without, malevolent Chinese behavior, the fact that China has been undergoing the lockdowns due to COVID, which of course precipitated those big demonstrations, means that Chinese plants aren't functioning. China isn't producing as many chips as it used to. The supply chains are getting jammed up, and therefore we can't produce cars any longer in Europe. So there's also a sense that, even where it's not malevolent political behavior, things can happen in China that can disrupt those supply chains. And again, Europe has to reshore some of the production back home, and also has to find those alternative suppliers elsewhere. Much like the United States, of course, has been persuading Taiwan and the TSMC Taiwanese chip maker to build a big plant in Arizona. So there is more sense of autonomy, strategic autonomy. That's the big buzzword in Brussels when you look at these foreign partners.
Let me bring Guido in here. Guido, let's talk about the other side of this, which isn't just the European Union and its position with China, but also the European Union and its position with the United States. How much friction and tension does this place on the relationship between the two?
First of all, I think Europe and the United States belong to the same family of institutions and culture. And of course, the transatlantic loyalty of Europe is key to the United States. So we go together. And if I go back to the long-term predictions OECD has made, so in 25 years, China's GDP is predicted to be much higher than that of the United States, 2/3 higher. Okay, and the difference, I was struck by looking at these numbers because the difference between the two GDPs would be exactly identical to the predicted difference, to the predicted GDP of the euro area. So the United States badly needs the euro area ties to equalize, to match the future economic power of China. And economic power means also, military expenses, technology. So I think it's important to strengthen the ties between the two sides of the Atlantic, the same family at the two sides of the Atlantic.
Well, hold on. It's important if you're the United States to strengthen the two sides there. But could Europe not look at this and from a certainly very selfish and internal perspective, look at this and say, do you know what, we'd rather sit this fight out, thank you very much. United States can have a go at China. We'll stick with China because they're going to be 2/3 wealthier a few years from now.
No, take you made this, the COVID example before. Now, the cooperation between United States and Europe in the COVID vaccination progress has been fundamental, okay? So German, Mainz, BioNTech, plus Pfizer, and then Moderna, okay, we had the top vaccines. Also Oxford, of course, and AstraZeneca, which saved India, by the way, which took, unlike China, a very open approach and licensed Oxford vaccine, and with the Serum Institute of India, eliminated the very, very dangerous variant of COVID, okay? So on the other side, we have China that developed vaccines with a low efficacy rate. They couldn't make the technological step and critically needed to save their country. And at the moment, they didn't even have the courage to vaccinate the over 80s enough. So I think the cooperation on technology in a free society, because the creativity and technology needs freedom of thought. So the cooperation between United States and Europe cannot be replaced by cooperation between Europe and China.
Amelia, I've got to ask you the same question on that front. Should Europe go with the United States? Should it sit this one out and go, well, we'd rather be neutral? Should it go with China?
Well, it's a complicated political actor, the European Union, and I think that's no secret. and it makes it fun to study and to analyze. But that doesn't mean that, it's in any sense inoperable. And the EU is not in the habit of sitting things out, quite frankly, and feels itself, I think, to be a world leader in many, many areas, including championing norms and human rights and values and democracy. And I think it's been really stout in this. Of course, it wants, relationships, financial and economic and investment based with China. But I would agree with Guido. I think if we're talking about a sort of family of nations, the natural course of events, I think, and the heritage on which this stands generally sees that European and American constructs and parallelisms and friendships, quite frankly, have usually stood the test of time. And I think it's important to remember that in recent days, we've seen President Biden being very careful, I think, in the ways in which he's dealt with President Xi Jinping, and has articulated that there doesn't necessarily need to be what he called a new Cold War. And he would only be able to say this, quite frankly, if he knew that he would be articulating the viewpoints from all of Europe, that nobody is actively looking for a conflict. I think there's a sense they want to manage that competition responsibly. So I think in terms of moving forward, there's a sense of wanting to achieve together between the United States and the European Union in terms of security and diplomacy and defense. But at this point, neither side have real concrete accomplishments. And this, I think everybody, in a sense, is waiting for the next person to move, if you like. And whoever moves first, that sort of first mover advantage, might be the one to sort of shift that balance of power, if you like.
Jamie, I've got to bring you in on this point. What's your opinion? I'm assuming you think the European Union should stick with the United States, their traditional allies, their traditional partners.
Yeah, most absolutely. I mean, the Ukraine conflict has shown clearly that without the enormous American assistance to Ukraine, Ukraine would never have been able to defend itself. The European effort alone would not have allowed Ukraine to survive. And we've also seen the United States put additional forces in Europe and equipment and headquarters to reinforce NATO as well. So in the security area, the transatlantic relationship is probably is as strong now as it's ever been. But the economic area is important too, and of course we had the false dawn of TTIP a few years back, which was more or less put on the back burner or in the freezer by President Trump. So the hope of a transatlantic free trade zone has not been revived by the Biden administration. The United States belatedly, of course, has realized that it's got to offer some kind of trading arrangement in the Indo-Pacific as well. Now the good news is to some degree that you could compensate for less trade with China and the authoritarian states by increasing interaction among the democratic countries themselves, particularly EU, United Nations. But of course, in economics, it's always more complicated. The good news is there's a Trade and Technology Council between Brussels and Washington to set some standards, particularly in data, that will free up a lot of trade. The downside is the United States has now come up with this so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which gives billions of subsidies to American producers. And of course, the worry in the EU is that those American subsidies are going to suck investment out of Europe into the United States. So the challenge, if we're really going to produce this kind of free trade area of the democracies, is to really sort of, get the economic agenda moving in lockstep with the security agenda.
Well, if I can quote Olaf Scholz here, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, has said in the last few days, and I quote, "We must also avoid the temptation to once again divide the world into blocs. This means making every effort to build new partnerships pragmatically and without ideological blinders." Well, there's a statement. If you're sitting in the White House, you look at that and you go, ooh. Amelia, what do you make of that?
I wasn't surprised to see Scholz coming out and saying this, and the new term that he has coined, Zeitenwende, the turning point in world affairs. And I think what he's talking about here, and he says it quite clearly, that we're in an exceptional phase of globalization. We've seen a lot of tipping points passed very, very rapidly, and a sort of accelerated sense that these tipping points are just going to continue. So he puts it down to a historic shift accelerated by the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia's war in the Ukraine, et cetera. And I think his worry is that if this continues, key global structures, perhaps even the Atlantic construct with Europe, are going to come unspun. And I think what he's suggesting is that just a slight slowing down and a sort of reconsideration of the very real, impracticalities of just instant, rapid decoupling. And what he said is, this doesn't warrant isolating Beijing or curbing cooperation. So he's trying to find a middle way, I think, and suggesting that it's not as bad as having to move towards what he calls a new global dichotomy. And that's fine. That's all very well and good. But I think Jamie put his finger on a really key point. Relations are not necessarily that cozy between the European Union and the United States. One direct result being the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and that subsidizing focus that this tax has not gone down well in Europe. And I think there's a real sense that an increased tension, I think, has crept into that transatlantic relationship.
Well, if I can ask you, Guido. Mr. Schultz would like to see the world not break out into more blocs. Has the horse already bolted on that front? Is he a bit late?
Yeah, probably he is. And of course, he's part of a coalition government. And also there is another exponent of the former government who is the head of the European Commission that may think a little differently. So I appreciate that Scholz is trying to bring peace, which is fantastic. At the same time, things have evolved.
Guido Cozzi, Amelia Hadfield, Jamie Shea, thank you very much for joining me. There's a lot more on this debate that could still be discussed. If you want to find some of that, head over to our YouTube channel and search for Roundtable TRT World. But from me now here and from all of the team, goodbye and thank you for watching.